For the third time in a single week, the HOA president drove straight through my ranch gate and destroyed my sick wife's healing garden. And that morning, I decided it would be the last time she ever tried it. It was 6:40 a.m. in rural East Texas. I stood at my kitchen window with a mug of black coffee, watching as her pearl-white Lexus LX460 tore through my private gate like it belonged to the county. Tires crushed the blue wildflowers my wife had planted during her chemotherapy breaks. My cattle scattered in panic, and the oxygen concentrator sitting on the porch abruptly shut off when the extension line snapped loose. She didn't slow down. She didn't look back. What that HOA Karen didn't know was that I had spent the entire weekend installing solid steel bollards beneath that driveway. And the very next time she tried to use my land as her personal shortcut, her Lexus never made it past my gate again. What would you do if someone kept driving through the one place your dying wife found peace? My name is Daniel Holt. I'm 59 years old, retired after 30 years in the Navy, where I specialized in hydraulic systems aboard aircraft carriers. These days, I raise cattle and take care of my wife, Emily, who's fighting stage 3 breast cancer on our small slice of quiet outside Cedar Ridge, Texas. We bought this ranch 6 years ago, right after her diagnosis. The doctor said stress was poison to her recovery, so we found 210 acres of rolling pasture cut by a shallow creek. Emily fell in love with the idea of building a butterfly sanctuary, native Texas wildflowers meant to attract monarchs during their migration. On her good days between chemo sessions, she'd sit on the wraparound porch with her oxygen tank humming beside her, watching orange and black wings drift through the garden she built with shaking hands and stubborn hope. Our ranch sits just over 2 miles outside the city limits, surrounded by open land on 3 sides and one polished subdivision called Brookstone Ridge. 200 houses, all beige stucco with red tile roofs, where the HOA ensures every mailbox is painted the exact same shade of dark green. Our problem started 3 months earlier with Linda Haraway, age 54, pharmaceutical regional director and iron grip president of the Brookstone Ridge HOA. She drives a white Lexus SUV with a vanity plate and enough inspirational bumper stickers to make your teeth ache. One morning, I was checking fence posts when I heard an ATV engine cutting across my property. I followed the noise and found Linda standing at my gate with a tape measure, heels sinking into gravel like she'd wandered onto the wrong movie set. She wore a tailored navy suit, perfectly pressed, completely out of place on a cattle ranch. I told her calmly, the way the Navy taught me, that this was private property and she needed to use the public access road. She looked at me like I'd insulted her. She said she'd been using this road since before we moved in and claimed a historical right-of-way to their subdivision's water pump station. Then she drove off, leaving ruts through Emily's carefully maintained path and diesel exhaust hanging in the air. When I walked back to the house, Emily was on the porch watching a monarch land on her honeysuckle vine. She asked who that was, her voice thin from yesterday's chemo. I told her it was nobody important, but my hands were already shaking, not fear. Rage. In the service, we called it seeing red. When someone threatens what you're sworn to protect, every instinct screams to eliminate the threat. But this wasn't a war zone. This was Texas, where you fight with paperwork and patience, or at least you're supposed to. Over the next few weeks, Linda escalated from ATV to SUV, claiming efficiency was necessary to inspect the water pump station. Every morning at exactly 7:20, that white Lexus came tearing through my gate, past my house, straight through Emily's garden. The cattle learned the sound of her engine and scattered automatically. My prize Angus bull panicked one morning and crashed through a fence section, slicing his hind leg on barbed wire. The vet bill came to $950. It was becoming obvious this had nothing to do with water infrastructure. It was about control, about showing rural folks who really ran things. Emily stopped sitting on the porch during treatments. She said it felt like we were living in a fishbowl. One night, watching her trampled flowers, I promised myself her sanctuary would stay sacred no matter the cost. 3 weeks into Linda's daily invasions, she raised the stakes. Every Tuesday became what she called HOA Inspection Day. She brought the entire board through my gate like tourists entering a park. 5 vehicles, a dozen people, marching around my ranch in khaki pants and logo polos, pointing at fence posts and taking measurements. I watched from my kitchen window as Linda stood in the middle of Emily's butterfly garden, clipboard in hand, suggesting it would be an ideal location for a community gazebo. Her designer boots crushed delicate flowers underfoot. The inspections were dangerous. People wandered through active cattle areas, left gates open, spooked animals weighing over 1,000 pounds. My herds mixed and scattered across the acreage I'd spent months organizing. My bull injured himself again during one of these tours, requiring stitches and weeks of antibiotics. The vet warned me next time could be fatal. But the worst part was watching Emily flinch every time car doors slammed outside. Her oncologist noticed the stress immediately. Blood pressure up, white cell count down, sleep disrupted. I knew I needed evidence, so I bought 6 trail cameras with motion sensors, the same passive infrared technology we used overseas for perimeter monitoring. I spent about $900 and installed them with overlapping coverage zones hidden in fence posts and trees. The footage told a story Linda didn't want told. She wasn't just bringing HOA members, she was charging them. I caught her on video collecting $60 bills from neighbors she'd invited on what she advertised online as authentic ranch access tours. Catching her wasn't a deterrent, it was reconnaissance. She spotted the cameras on her 3rd tour and waved at them, smiling, daring me to try something. That night, I reviewed the footage. 43 trespassing incidents in 3 weeks, all time-stamped and GPS tagged. I cross-checked the dates with HOA meeting schedules and noticed every tour happened right before votes on rural property issues. I called my old Navy buddy Mark, now a property attorney. He said it was clear criminal trespass with commercial intent, but advised I needed financial records and witness statements to prove pattern and motive. That same evening, Emily found the strength to plant a new section of her garden, slow and careful, resting between rows. I promised her no one would drive through her flowers again. 2 weeks later, Linda made her boldest move yet. She filed an official claim with the county, asserting a right-of-way easement on my land, and announced plans to install an HOA security booth next to my gate. The notice arrived like a legal grenade. A hearing was scheduled for the following Friday at 2:15 p.m. The bank froze our equity line after receiving a county inquiry. Insurance threatened to review our coverage. Medical bills piled up. Neighbors started asking questions, doubt creeping into their voices. That night, lying beside Emily listening to her oxygen machine cycle, my hands shook for the first time since my service days. This wasn't combat, but it felt like war. The next morning, I hired a professional surveyor and drove to the courthouse. If Linda wanted a legal fight, I was done playing defense. I spent hours digging through property records and found the truth. There was no historical easement, none. The road existed because it was convenient, not legal. And the survey revealed something else Linda hadn't counted on. The HOA's waterline crossed 3 other private properties without permission. 15 years of illegal access. I visited each neighbor, cattle ranchers, horse breeders, families who'd been quietly intimidated for years. The pattern was undeniable. Linda wasn't enforcing rules, she was running a campaign. By the time the county hearing arrived, I walked in carrying a banker's box of documentation. Linda walked in confident. She left pale. The hearing was postponed pending proof she couldn't produce. As we exited, the planning director told me quietly to document everything. That night, Emily sat on the porch watching monarchs return to her garden. She asked how it went. I told her we were winning, but it wasn't over. And I knew Linda Haraway wasn't done yet. Linda Haraway did not take losing quietly, and 2 days after the county hearing, she proved exactly how dangerous entitlement becomes when it's cornered. Early Thursday morning, a formal nuisance complaint arrived by certified mail, 12 dense pages accusing my ranch of outdated agricultural practices, health violations, and aesthetic damage to Brookstone Ridge property values. The language was aggressive and deliberately vague, demanding what she called agricultural modernization and threatening daily fines of $475 until compliance with undefined standards was achieved. In plain terms, it said this cattle ranch offends suburban sensibilities and therefore must be controlled. The following Tuesday, a county inspector arrived in a white government pickup. His name was Alvarez, and the look on his face said he already knew this was harassment. He walked my property for nearly 3 hours, checking feed storage, fencing, water systems, manure management, and animal health records. Everything passed. He told me quietly that my operation was cleaner than most facilities he inspected, but protocol required documentation. Still, the stress was doing damage. That Thursday, Emily collapsed during chemotherapy and spent the night hospitalized. I sat in a molded plastic chair beside her bed, listening to machines beep, realizing stress was now doing what cancer hadn't managed yet. That weekend, I went back to the courthouse and stayed there 3 full days, photographing permits, easement files, tax records, and planning documents. Public records tell the truth if you're patient enough to read them. Somewhere in that paper maze, I found it. The original water easement Linda relied on had expired in 1989. Expired meant void. The county had sent renewal notices. No response was ever filed. The HOA simply kept using the land and hoped no one would notice. For more than a decade, that worked. The paperwork had been filed away, unchecked. But in 2006, when Linda became HOA president, she discovered the lapse and didn't fix it legally. She fixed it criminally. Forged easement documents appeared in the county archive, backdated, stamped, notarized by officials who were either retired or dead, carrying a county seal design that didn't exist when the document was supposedly signed. When I called Mark and read him the findings, his voice dropped. This wasn't just trespassing, it was document forgery, wire fraud, and conspiracy tied to property rights, federal territory. Over the next week, I gathered statements from my neighbors. Each one had been threatened, pressured, or quietly intimidated. None had ever granted access. Then, my trail cameras captured something unexpected. Just after midnight on a Wednesday, Linda's husband, Thomas Haraway, stood at my gate for nearly 20 minutes, measuring fence spacing and photographing the driveway. The next morning, my phone rang. It was Thomas. He asked to meet. We sat in a diner outside town, neutral ground. He slid a manila folder across the table. Inside were copies of the real expired easement, the county renewal notice, and forged replacements created years later. He told me he was filing for divorce and wanted no part of what Linda had built. She believed the lies had become truth because no one challenged them. With that folder, the case changed from civil dispute to criminal conspiracy. I contacted a federal prosecutor named Allison Grant, formerly with Financial Crimes. She reviewed the evidence and said it was the cleanest forgery chain she'd seen in years. We coordinated carefully. Complaints were filed with the sheriff, district attorney, attorney general, and FBI field office. Meanwhile, Linda escalated publicly. She told residents I was threatening their water supply. Emergency HOA meetings were held. Social media posts accused me of extremism. Legal threats arrived demanding removal of illegal barriers I hadn't even installed yet. Her panic was obvious. That panic is what made her predictable. Through Thomas, I learned she planned to forcibly remove any security I installed during the annual HOA water inspection scheduled for April 18th. She intended to do it publicly, with witnesses, to assert dominance. I prepared accordingly. I contacted a Houston security contractor specializing in embassy-grade vehicle barriers. The system they installed used hydraulically powered steel bollards, 6 inches thick, capable of stopping a full-size SUV at 15 miles per hour. Fully permitted, fully documented. Warning signage installed according to state code. Total cost came to $11,800, less than the cumulative damage she'd already caused. Sensors were embedded in the driveway, calibrated to trigger only for unauthorized vehicles above a set speed. Cameras recorded everything in high resolution, encrypted, time-stamped, court-admissible. Emily helped test the system one evening, driving slowly through while warning lights activated but the bollards stayed down. We waited. Linda responded exactly as expected. She announced a community convoy to demonstrate HOA authority, 15 vehicles planning to drive through my ranch during the inspection. She live-streamed the announcement, framing it as a stand against intimidation. Federal investigators monitored the feed. On the morning of the convoy, I sat on the porch with Emily as monarch butterflies drifted over her garden. The convoy arrived just before 11. Linda's Lexus led the line. She saw the warning signs and ignored them. When her vehicle crossed the sensors at speed, the hydraulics engaged. The bollards rose in half a second. The impact destroyed the Lexus's undercarriage instantly. The convoy froze. Federal agents moved in. Linda was arrested on live video, charged with trespassing, conspiracy, forgery, wire fraud, and obstruction. Her followers watched in real time as the truth collapsed. By noon, multiple arrests were made. Vehicles were impounded. Evidence was secured. Emily watched from the porch, calm for the first time in months. Justice didn't feel loud. It felt precise, and it wasn't finished yet. By the time the sun reached its highest point, my ranch looked less like pasture land and more like the center of a federal operation, and the speed at which everything escalated made it clear this was no longer just an HOA dispute spiraling out of control. Linda Haraway's Lexus sat wedged between the raised steel bollards like a trophy of poor decision-making, steam hissing from the ruptured engine while transmission fluid bled into the gravel. The horn blared non-stop, a panicked mechanical scream that matched her own as federal agents pulled her from the vehicle and placed her in handcuffs. Her livestream was still running, broadcasting every second to hundreds of residents who had tuned in expecting a show of authority and instead watched their HOA president arrested in front of them. The convoy behind her unraveled instantly. Drivers argued, reversed into each other, and shouted questions no one could answer. Some residents stepped out of their vehicles, confused and frightened, suddenly realizing they'd followed someone into a crime scene. Within minutes, sheriff's deputies arrived to secure the perimeter, while federal investigators began documenting everything, photographing the bollards, the vehicle damage, the warning signs, and the convoy positioning. Each detail mattered. Each angle told a story of intent, warning, and willful violation. As Linda was led away, still shouting about her rights and authority, I stood beside Emily on the porch. Her oxygen tank hummed steadily, her face pale but calm. For the first time in months, there was no fear in her eyes when engines revved or doors slammed. What she saw instead was finality. One of the agents approached me and asked for a statement. I handed over a prepared folder containing incident logs, camera footage, survey records, easement documents, financial summaries, and sworn neighbor statements. Everything was indexed, cross-referenced, and time-stamped. Years of discipline don't fade. The agent nodded, impressed, and told me quietly that this level of documentation made prosecution straightforward. Across the pasture, Linda's hired security consultant attempted to run. He didn't make it far. Agents tackled him near the edge of Emily's butterfly garden, the irony thick as he landed among blooming flowers he'd never respected. He was cuffed and escorted away, protesting loudly about contracts and misunderstandings that no one bothered to acknowledge. News crews arrived before the tow truck finished extracting the Lexus. Reporters filmed the damaged vehicle, the bollards lowering and rising for demonstration, and the digital sign I'd activated near the gate displaying side-by-side images of the authentic expired easement and the forged replacement. Red circles highlighted impossible dates, mismatched seals, and altered signatures. The visual was devastating. Even viewers with no legal background could see something was wrong. Interviews followed. Neighbors spoke on camera about years of intimidation, sudden fines, unexplained fee increases, and fear of retaliation. By late afternoon, the narrative had flipped completely. What began as a supposed rural obstruction had become a story of long-running fraud hidden behind suburban polish. Linda's authority evaporated in real time. That evening, after the last patrol car left and the ranch fell quiet again, Emily and I sat together, watching the sunset stretch across the pasture. Monarch butterflies returned to the garden as if nothing had happened, landing on blooms she'd planted with trembling hands months earlier. She asked if it was finally over. I told her the hard part was done, but consequences still had to land. I was right. The following weeks moved faster than any civil case I'd ever seen. Federal prosecutors filed formal charges within 10 days. Linda Haraway was indicted on multiple counts including wire fraud, mail fraud, document forgery, conspiracy, and obstruction. The evidence from the live stream alone removed any room for denial. Financial records showed inflated HOA fees tied directly to infrastructure costs that should never have existed. Residents began demanding answers from the remaining board members, who resigned one by one. Emergency elections were scheduled, and interim management was assigned by the county. The class action lawsuit formed almost immediately. 200 households joined, represented by a firm specializing in fraud recovery. They used my documentation as the foundation. Settlement negotiations didn't last long. The numbers were too clean. Over 15 years, more than $1.9 million had been collected under false pretenses. Linda's assets were frozen, properties seized, accounts audited. Her husband cooperated fully, providing testimony that confirmed timelines and intent. In exchange, he received immunity. It didn't save the marriage, but it saved him from sharing her fate. Meanwhile, Marcus Reed, the so-called security consultant, was charged separately for operating without a license and participating in conspiracy. His past convictions resurfaced, painting a clear picture of a man who made a living attaching himself to desperate people. Emily's health began to improve once the stress disappeared. Her oncologist noticed changes within weeks. Blood pressure stabilized, sleep returned, treatments became more effective. The human body, it turns out, keeps score. Community attitudes shifted too. People who'd once avoided eye contact now waved when they drove past. Some even stopped to apologize. The new HOA leadership approached me formally, requesting legitimate easement negotiations. Surveys were conducted, agreements drafted, compensation established at $5,200 per year for lawful access, retroactive payments included. Similar deals were signed with my neighbors. For the first time, everything was above board. 3 months after the arrest, Linda entered a guilty plea. 4 years in federal prison, full restitution ordered, no appeal. Watching the sentencing online, I felt no triumph, only closure. Justice doesn't always feel loud. Sometimes it feels like silence finally returning where chaos lived too long. With part of the recovered funds, Emily and I expanded the butterfly sanctuary. 3 acres of native wildflowers replaced what had once been tire tracks and dust. Researchers from a nearby university requested access to monitor migration patterns. They called it one of the healthiest private habitats they'd seen in years. I didn't dismantle the Bollards. I didn't need to. Their presence alone changed behavior. Word travels fast in rural counties. People learned what happens when entitlement meets preparation. A small legal defense fund grew out of the case, supported by donations from veterans and landowners who'd followed the story. We used it to help others facing similar pressure, not with threats, but with documentation and precision. Months later, a letter arrived from prison. Linda expressed regret and asked for forgiveness. Emily read it, folded it, and said forgiveness didn't erase accountability. I agreed. The ranch returned to being what it was meant to be. Quiet, safe, ours, and that should have been the end. But it wasn't. It should have ended with Linda Haraway's sentencing, but consequences have a way of rippling outward long after the source disappears, and the months that followed proved that unraveling a 15-year fraud leaves damage behind even when justice moves fast. The first wave hit Brookstone Ridge itself. With the HOA board dissolved and federal auditors combing through accounts, residents were forced to confront how deeply they'd been manipulated. Emergency meetings replaced neighborhood barbecues, mailboxes filled with legal notices instead of newsletters. Families who'd trusted Linda without question now discovered their water bills had quietly subsidized forged documents, illegal access, and intimidation campaigns against people they'd never bothered to meet. The new interim board invited me and the other affected landowners to a public forum, not to argue, but to explain. Standing in that community center, facing rows of folding chairs filled with stunned faces, I laid out the timeline calmly, step by step. No insults, no triumph, just facts, dates, documents, numbers. You could feel the room deflate as realization set in. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was systematic fraud carried out in their name. That forum triggered the second wave. Residents began comparing notes, old emails, unexplained fines, threats disguised as policy reminders. A retired accountant found discrepancies in archived budgets. A former board secretary admitted she'd been told not to ask questions. The class action lawsuit expanded as more evidence surfaced and settlement funds were recalculated upward. What had once been framed as isolated overcharges now clearly formed a long-running scheme. Federal investigators returned multiple times, interviewing residents, collecting statements, building airtight cases not just against Linda, but against the structures that allowed her behavior to persist unchecked. It became obvious how power concentrates when no one challenges it, especially in places where compliance is mistaken for community spirit. On the ranch, life slowly stabilized. With legal easements signed and compensation secured, the daily tension evaporated. Gates stayed closed, vehicles stayed out, my cattle returned to predictable routines, and fence repairs finally held. Emily reclaimed the porch as her own again, sitting wrapped in a blanket, oxygen line humming, watching monarchs trace lazy arcs over the fields. The garden expanded steadily. Native milkweed, zinnias, cosmos, Indian blanket flowers. Each new bloom felt like reclaimed ground. Her doctors confirmed the improvement wasn't coincidence. Stress hormones drop, immune response strengthens. It's basic biology. Peace mattered more than any medication adjustment. The defense fund took shape almost accidentally. Word spread after the news coverage aired statewide. Veterans, farmers, and rural homeowners started calling, asking how to protect themselves from similar HOA overreach. I didn't advertise. I didn't need to. People recognize competence when they see it. Mark volunteered his time initially, helping draft templates for record requests and easement verification. Donations trickled in, then surged. We set strict rules. No theatrics, no threats, only documentation, surveys, and lawful pressure. The goal wasn't revenge, it was prevention. Within weeks, we assisted a family in the next county whose land had been quietly encroached upon by a developer using nearly identical tactics. The documents fell apart under scrutiny. The encroachment stopped before it escalated. Brookstone Ridge elected a new HOA board by late summer. The first resolution they passed eliminated discretionary enforcement powers and mandated independent legal review for any property action affecting non-HOA land. They also issued public apologies to affected landowners, including my neighbors. Some of those apologies were awkward, others sincere. All were overdue. Relationships didn't magically heal, but the hostility dissipated. Suburban residents began attending agricultural workshops hosted by local ranchers. Kids who'd never touched soil before learned where food came from. Emily's butterfly sanctuary became a quiet bridge between worlds that had never bothered understanding each other. Linda Haraway faded from conversation quickly once the spectacle ended. Prison strips people of the narratives they rely on. Her sentence removed her ability to control the story. The letter she sent wasn't the last. A second arrived months later, more restrained, less defensive. Emily chose not to respond again. Forgiveness doesn't require dialogue, it requires distance. Marcus Reed's case resolved separately. He took a plea deal, served time, and vanished from public view. The system did what it was designed to do when presented with clear evidence and patient persistence. The Bollards never deployed again. They didn't need to. Their presence alone altered behavior. The cameras remained active, quietly recording nothing but wind and wildlife. Sometimes I reviewed footage just to reassure myself the chaos was truly gone. It was. The ranch returned to being what it had been meant to be from the start, a place to heal, not defend. Emily's strength returned gradually. Treatments ended. Remission followed. The day her oncologist used that word, we didn't celebrate loudly. We went home, sat on the porch, and watched butterflies until sunset. Some victories deserve silence. Late that fall, I received an unexpected call from the county planning director. He thanked me, formally, for exposing systemic failures that had gone unchecked for years. Policy changes were underway. Easement renewals would no longer be assumed. Audits would be mandatory. Oversight tightened. It didn't erase the past, but it reduced the chance of repetition. That mattered. Systems don't change because of outrage. They change because someone proves the weakness with evidence no one can ignore. The ranch hosted its first open day the following spring. Not tours, education, property rights workshops, survey demonstrations, document verification sessions. Veterans shared stories of applying military discipline to civilian problems without violence. Emily spoke briefly about stress, healing, and the quiet power of boundaries. Monarchs filled the air as if on cue. People listened. They asked questions. They learned. For the first time since we bought the land, the gate stayed open by choice, not intrusion. I thought often about how close we'd come to losing everything, not through fire or flood, but through paper and arrogance. The lesson wasn't philosophical. It was practical. Preparation beats intimidation. Records beat rhetoric. And patience, applied relentlessly, outlasts entitlement every time. Still, part of me knew patterns repeat. People like Linda don't disappear. They relocate. They try again elsewhere, convinced the last outcome was an anomaly. I kept the cameras active. I kept the files updated, not out of paranoia, but readiness, because peace isn't passive. It's maintained. 3 months after the open day, an envelope arrived from a neighboring county addressed simply to ranch owner. Inside was a copy of a mineral rights claim, poorly forged, dated years after the supposed signer's death. I recognized the structure immediately. Same arrogance, same assumption no one would check. I smiled, folded the paper, and added it to a new file. Some lessons spread faster than others, and some people never learn at all. The mineral rights claim didn't arrive with drama or threats, just quiet confidence printed on cheap paper, and that alone told me everything I needed to know about the person behind it. The document was styled to look official, complete with a county header, reference numbers, and a signature dated August 14, 2012, supposedly transferring subsurface rights beneath my ranch to a limited liability company I'd never heard of. The signer had been dead since 2007. The notary stamp belonged to an office that hadn't existed for a decade. It was amateur work compared to Linda Haraway's forgery operation, but it relied on the same assumption. Rural landowners wouldn't check, wouldn't push back, wouldn't know where to look. I placed the document on my kitchen table beside the previous files and didn't feel anger this time. I felt familiarity. The playbook was obvious now. Someone saw what Linda tried, misunderstood why it failed, and thought copying the surface would be enough. It never is. 2 days later, a woman introduced herself at my gate. Mid-40s, tailored jacket, leased SUV, clipboard held like armor. She didn't ask permission to enter. She announced intent. Her name was Karen Blake, regional asset coordinator for a shell company called Lone Prairie Resources. She claimed they'd acquired mineral rights beneath several rural parcels and were conducting preliminary access assessments. I told her calmly that no such rights existed. She smiled politely and said disputes could be handled through arbitration if necessary. It was the same smile Linda used early on, polished, dismissive, certain. I asked her to leave. She didn't argue. She wrote something down and drove away. By that afternoon, my phone started ringing. Neighbors asking if I'd sold mineral rights. A local bank requesting clarification about subsurface claims. An insurance adjuster leaving a voicemail about potential coverage implications. Karen Blake hadn't wasted time. She'd already started seeding doubt. That night, I pulled the records. Mineral rights are separate from surface rights, and confusion thrives where paperwork is complex. Within hours, I traced the claim's origin to a bulk filing made 3 counties over, submitted electronically with minimal verification. The company existed on paper only, registered to a post office box, and dissolved twice under previous names. This wasn't development, it was leverage. Pressure tactics designed to scare landowners into settlements. The next morning, I contacted Mark in the Defense Fund's advisory group. We'd seen variations of this before, but never aimed directly at us. We agreed on one rule: respond faster than intimidation spreads. By noon, certified letters were sent to the county clerk, attorney general's office, and the company's registered agent demanding documentation. Simultaneously, I filed a notice of dispute formally contesting the claim, attaching death certificates, notary verification failures, and chain of title analysis going back 50 years. Facts beat confidence every time. Karen Blake returned 3 days later, this time with a man who introduced himself as a consultant. He avoided eye contact and spoke only when prompted. She suggested mediation, hinted at drilling rights, and warned that delays could result in court action. I told her she was standing on private property without permission and needed to leave immediately. She hesitated just long enough for my cameras to record everything. When she left, she didn't smile. The certainty was cracking. The company escalated on paper, A demand letter arrived claiming damages for interference with lawful exploration, quoting statutes out of context and inflating potential liability figures. The numbers were impressive enough to scare someone unfamiliar with legal mechanics. I forwarded it to Mark, who laughed and highlighted 6 fatal errors in the first paragraph alone. Still, intimidation relies on volume, not accuracy. Karen Blake understood that. She began contacting residents again, suggesting shared mineral basins and collective liability. Fear spreads faster than truth if left alone. We didn't leave it alone. Within a week, the Defense Fund organized a public workshop at the ranch. Mineral rights explained plainly: how to verify claims, how to read filing dates, how to identify shell entities. Attendance exceeded expectations. Ranchers, homeowners, even a few local bankers showed up. Karen Blake didn't attend, but someone from her company did, sitting silently in the back taking notes. Transparency is kryptonite to fraud. The turning point came unexpectedly. A county clerk from the neighboring jurisdiction called me directly. She'd received multiple filings from Lone Prairie Resources and noticed discrepancies. She asked if I'd seen similar documents. I emailed her everything. 2 days later, the state launched an inquiry. Quietly, methodically. Karen Blake stopped calling. The company's website went offline. The registered agent resigned. A week later, I received a subpoena requesting records related to the mineral claim. I complied fully. Investigators found the same pattern repeated across 7 counties: forged signatures, invalid notarizations, threat letters timed to coincide with planting seasons and loan renewals. It was Linda Haraway's strategy stripped of polish and scaled down, less sophisticated, just as illegal. Karen Blake was arrested 2 months later on charges including attempted fraud and filing false instruments. No spectacle this time, no live stream, just accountability. Her company dissolved permanently, claims voided, notices issued statewide warning clerks to flag similar filings. The system adapted because someone pushed back early. Life on the ranch settled again. Emily's garden reached full bloom that summer, monarchs clustering so thick it looked like the air itself was moving. She laughed more, slept better. Strength returned in increments that felt miraculous only because we'd nearly lost them. Stress had been the hidden enemy all along. Remove it, and healing followed. The Defense Fund expanded quietly. More cases, same approach, documentation, speed, calm pressure, no drama. We didn't chase villains, we dismantled tactics. That mattered more. I kept the mineral rights file open on my desk, not as a warning, but as a reminder. People will always try shortcuts when they believe no one is watching. The difference now was simple. Someone was. Late one evening, Emily asked if I ever regretted standing my ground so publicly. I told her no, not because it was righteous, but because it worked. Silence only protects aggressors. Preparation protects peace. As the sun set over the pasture and monarchs settled for the night, the ranch felt whole again. For now. And if someone tried again, they wouldn't find confusion waiting. They'd find clarity, records, and a very closed gate. The arrest of Karen Blake didn't make headlines the way Linda Haraway's downfall had, but it did something more important. It confirmed a pattern I could no longer ignore. What had started as a single HOA president abusing power had revealed an entire ecosystem built on the assumption that rural landowners were slow, uninformed, and unlikely to fight back. Once that assumption broke, the behavior didn't stop. It adapted. Quietly. Subtly. And that was what made the months that followed more dangerous than anything before. There were no convoys, no shouting, no live streams, just paperwork, phone calls, and pressure applied at moments calculated to hurt the most. Loan renewals, medical billing cycles, planting seasons, stress points. Whoever studied this playbook understood leverage. The first sign came in the form of a zoning inquiry from the county, politely worded, asking for clarification on non-residential usage indicators detected on my property. No accusation, no threat, just a request. The indicators referenced vehicle traffic, gatherings, and signage related to the Defense Fund workshops. Perfectly legal activities, but framed carefully enough to imply scrutiny. I responded with permits, attendance records, and affidavits showing no commercial operation. The inquiry closed quietly. 2 weeks later, a different county sent a similar letter to Tom Henderson. Then Maria Santos. Then Bill Crawford. Different language, same structure. Someone was testing the perimeter again. We met at my kitchen table, maps and documents spread out the way they'd been months earlier. But this time, the mood was different. There was no fear, no confusion, just recognition. This wasn't retaliation from individuals. This was institutional pushback from interests that had benefited from the old imbalance. Developers, management firms, legal intermediaries who thrived in gray areas. They didn't want headlines. They wanted exhaustion. The goal wasn't to win outright. It was to make resistance too costly to maintain. The defense fund adjusted accordingly. We standardized responses, created shared databases, and coordinated timelines so no one was isolated. When one property owner received an inquiry, 3 others preemptively filed disclosures. When one county questioned land use, adjacent counties received notice packets clarifying compliance. Sunlight again proved effective. Quiet pressure loses strength when it's mirrored. Emily watched all of this from the porch, stronger now, her treatments behind her, her days structured around tending the garden and meeting with researchers, studying monarch migration patterns. The sanctuary had become more than a personal refuge. It was data, proof that land left undisturbed healed faster than land constantly stressed. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. A local university published preliminary findings linking uninterrupted habitat zones with increased monarch survival rates. The ranch was cited as a case study. Attention shifted from conflict to contribution. That shift irritated the wrong people. An anonymous complaint alleged misuse of conservation funds. Another claimed improper installation of security infrastructure. Both were investigated, both dismissed. But each required time, paperwork, explanations. Death by 1,000 cuts. I recognized the tactic from my service days. When you can't break the defense, you wear it down. The difference now was that I wasn't alone, and I wasn't improvising. We documented everything, not just for defense, but for pattern recognition. The break came unexpectedly through an unlikely channel. A junior analyst at a regional development firm contacted the defense fund anonymously. She'd noticed internal memos referencing rural resistance clusters and compliance fatigue thresholds, language that stripped people down to variables. She provided copies. They outlined strategies for increasing regulatory friction around landowners who successfully blocked easements, mineral claims, or HOA expansion. The memos weren't illegal on their face. They were strategic, coordinated, and they crossed ethical lines so clearly that even she couldn't ignore them. We handed everything to state regulators, not with outrage, with structure, dates, correspondence, cross-reference complaints. The response was slow but deliberate. Agencies don't move fast when confronting systemic issues, but they do move when the evidence removes plausible deniability. Audits were launched, communication channels traced. The same development firms appeared repeatedly, always just one step removed from direct action. Consultants, shell advisors, plausible distance. During this time, Emily's health reached a milestone we'd barely dared to imagine months earlier. Her oncologist confirmed sustained remission. No qualifiers, no cautious language, just confirmation. We didn't celebrate publicly. We planted more milkweed, expanded the sanctuary another half-acre. Life continued forward, quietly asserting itself. The audits eventually produced consequences, fines, policy revisions, quiet resignations. No single villain this time. No dramatic arrest, just the slow dismantling of an approach that depended on silence and fragmentation. Counties began coordinating across jurisdictions. Shared databases flagged repeat complainants. Filings received additional scrutiny. The pressure campaign lost efficiency once exposed. Resistance became normalized. By the end of the year, the ranch felt settled in a way I hadn't known was possible. The cameras stayed active, but they recorded nothing but wind, wildlife, and the occasional curious deer. The bollards remained retracted, silent reminders rather than active defenses. Emily hosted small groups of students learning about pollinators, her voice steady, her laughter easy. The place that had once felt under siege now felt anchored. One evening, as the sun dipped low and monarchs clustered on branches like living ornaments, Emily asked me a question I hadn't expected. She asked if I thought this cycle would ever truly end. I told her the truth. No, it wouldn't. Not entirely. Power always looks for unguarded edges, but awareness changes outcomes. Once people know how pressure works, it loses its mystique. Once documentation becomes habit, intimidation loses leverage. A week later, A county official stopped by unannounced, not for an inspection, to say thank you. He said the changes implemented because of our case had already prevented 3 questionable filings from advancing. He said it quietly, almost embarrassed, like admitting the system had failed before. I accepted the thanks without ceremony. The work wasn't about credit, it was about balance. As winter settled in, the ranch entered its quiet season. No meetings, no letters, no threats, just cold mornings, warm coffee, and the steady rhythm of land at rest. I kept the files updated anyway. Old habits don't fade, they evolve. And somewhere beyond the pasture line, I knew there were people still watching, still calculating. Let them. This ground had learned to push back. Winter didn't arrive with drama, just a slow tightening of the air and a quiet that settled over the ranch like a held breath. And for the first time in over a year, that quiet felt earned rather than temporary. Mornings returned to routine. Coffee before sunrise, fence lines checked out of habit, not fear, cattle moving predictably instead of scattering at engine noise. Emily slept through the night without flinching at distant sounds, her oxygen machine now more precaution than necessity. The butterfly sanctuary rested in its dormant phase, milkweed stalks trimmed back, soil protected, waiting for spring. On the surface, it looked like the conflict had finally burned itself out. Underneath, I knew better. Systems don't collapse overnight. They retreat, regroup, and wait for attention to drift. The first hint came from the Defense Fund inbox in late January. A rancher from 2 counties west reported a sudden survey notice claiming discrepancies along his eastern boundary. Nothing overtly hostile, just a recommendation for clarification. A week later, a widow near the river received a mineral inquiry tied to a newly registered holding company. Different name, same structure. The filings weren't fraudulent on their face, they were aggressive, carefully legal, pressure without fingerprints. This was the next evolution. No more forged signatures, no more midnight trespass, just overwhelming people with process until resistance felt pointless. We adjusted again. The Defense Fund shifted from reactive assistance to early warning coordination. Shared calendars tracked filings across counties. When one landowner received a notice, others reviewed their records preemptively. Patterns emerged quickly. The same survey firms, the same legal intermediaries, the same consultants drafting letters that looked independent but shared identical phrasing. It wasn't criminal yet. It was strategic saturation, and it relied on one thing: isolation. Emily followed these developments closely, not with fear, but with clarity. She said something one evening that stuck with me. She said, "Pressure works best when people believe they're alone. The moment they realize they're part of a pattern, the pressure flips direction." She was right. We leaned into that truth. Quietly, methodically. No press releases, no confrontations, just coordination. By February, county clerks began calling us before filings were finalized, not officially, off the record, asking if certain entities looked familiar. That shift mattered. It meant awareness had reached the administrative layer where decisions quietly shape outcomes. The Defense Fund provided reference materials, not accusations, just histories, dates, connections. Letting officials draw their own conclusions preserved neutrality while still slowing questionable actions. The effect compounded. One afternoon, a representative from a regional development coalition requested a meeting. He framed it as dialogue, collaboration, a desire to move past misunderstandings. He arrived in a polished truck, wearing a friendly expression practiced enough to feel impersonal. He spoke about growth pressures, infrastructure needs, balancing interests. I listened. Then I asked him why every project he referenced relied on pushing costs and risks onto landowners least equipped to absorb them. He didn't answer directly, he talked around it. That told me enough. We ended the meeting politely. No agreements, no threats, just clarity. That same week, Emily received confirmation that her remission markers remained stable. No recurrence, no anomalies. We marked the moment not with celebration, but with expansion. Another quarter-acre of habitat prepared, native grasses seeded. The sanctuary had become its own form of resistance, proof that land left alone could generate value without extraction. Researchers returned, setting up new observation points. Students followed. Quiet attention replaced hostile scrutiny. The pressure campaign lost momentum as winter gave way to early spring. Filings slowed, letters stopped arriving, survey crews redirected elsewhere. It wasn't defeat, it was recalculation. People pursuing leverage prefer easy terrain. The ranch, and those connected to it, no longer qualified. We'd raise the cost of interference without raising our voices. That's how balance restores itself. In March, the Defense Fund hosted a closed workshop for county officials, surveyors, and legal clerks. Not training, information exchange, common pitfalls, red flags, historical case studies stripped of names. The room was full. Questions were sharp, conversations honest. No one wanted to be the weak link that allowed another Linda Haraway or Karen Blake to thrive unchecked. Systems adapt when enough people care about integrity more than convenience. On the ranch, spring announced itself early. Milkweed shoots pushed through soil. Monarchs arrived ahead of schedule, drawn by the expanding habitat. Emily walked the garden daily, slower than before, but steady. Strength had returned in layers, physical, emotional, psychological. The place that had once magnified stress now absorbed it. That transformation felt deliberate, earned through resistance that never turned into bitterness. I received one last letter that season. No threats, no demands, just a notice that a proposed zoning amendment affecting rural easements had been withdrawn pending further study. No explanation given, no attribution. But the timing was clear. Pressure had met preparation and decided to look elsewhere. For now. One evening, sitting on the porch watching monarchs settle for the night, Emily asked if I thought people like Linda ever believed they were villains. I told her no. They believe they're entitled to outcomes because systems failed to correct them early. That belief hardens over time, until it breaks. She nodded and said that was why boundaries matter before conflicts escalate. She understood this now in ways neither of us had before. The Defense Fund's caseload stabilized, fewer emergencies, more preventative guidance. That was the goal all along, not to fight endlessly, but to make fighting unnecessary. When people know where lines are drawn, fewer cross them accidentally or otherwise. Documentation became habit, verification normalized. Silence stopped being the default response to pressure. As April approached, the anniversary of the convoy incident passed quietly. No news coverage, no reminders, just a sense of distance from a moment that had once consumed everything. The bollards remained in place, retracted, inactive, symbolic more than functional. Cameras recorded nothing unusual. The ranch felt like itself again, not naive, not guarded, just grounded. I knew the cycle wasn't truly over. Power tests boundaries the way water tests stone, but stone reshapes water too, given time. Preparation had changed the terrain. Anyone looking for easy leverage would move on. Anyone determined enough to try anyway would find resistance calibrated, calm, and informed. That was enough. The final confirmation came unexpectedly. Through absence. No letters, no filings, no inquiries. Weeks passed, then months. The system had absorbed the lesson, at least for now. As summer approached and the sanctuary filled with life, the ranch stood not as a symbol of conflict but of balance restored, and that balance, once achieved, is worth defending quietly, patiently, and without apology. The story didn't end with a courtroom gavel or a dramatic final confrontation, because real endings rarely announce themselves that way. And what followed unfolded quietly, almost gently, until one day the pressure that had lived in our chests for so long was simply gone. Summer settled fully over the ranch, not as a victory lap, but as confirmation. No unfamiliar trucks slowed near the fence line, no certified envelopes waited at the mailbox, no late-night headlights cut across the pasture. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was stable. Emily's butterfly sanctuary expanded far beyond what we'd imagined during those chemo days, turning into a living system instead of a coping project. Monarchs arrived in waves, clinging to milkweed until branches bowed under their weight, and researchers returned with better equipment, marking long-term observation plots and talking about migration corridors and ecological resilience. The language sounded different, but the principle was the same one that had carried us through the fight. Stability comes from preparation, not force. The Ranch Rights Defense Fund shifted naturally into maintenance mode. The frantic calls stopped. What came instead were quiet requests for confirmation, second opinions, reassurance before someone responded to a letter that felt wrong. Fear had been replaced by competence. Mark formalized the operation legally, stepping in as managing counsel without ceremony, and veterans volunteered to help translate paperwork for people who'd never expected to need it. The system lost its teeth once people understood how it worked. Emily's health held steady, remission confirmed again and again without qualifiers, and watching her walk the garden unassisted felt unreal compared to the days when an engine in the driveway made her heart race. Stress had been the invisible enemy all along, and once it was removed, healing followed. Late one afternoon, a county official stopped by without an appointment. No clipboard, no inspection, just a handshake and a quiet thank you. He explained that new policies triggered by earlier cases had already blocked multiple questionable filings before they ever reached landowners. He said it plainly, like reporting the weather, then left. Systems correcting themselves rarely make noise. That evening, Emily and I sat on the porch watching monarchs settle as the sun dipped low, and she asked if the ranch would ever just be a ranch again, without the weight of what happened attached to it. I told her it already was. Land doesn't remember conflict the way people do. It responds to how it's treated now. Boundaries drawn, pressure removed, care applied consistently. Weeks later, the defense fund received what turned out to be its final case tied to the original pattern. A landowner asked us to review documents. We verified them. They were legitimate. No action needed. He said he slept better knowing he'd checked, and that was the point all along. Not endless battles, but the confidence to verify before fear took over. The bollards remained installed, retracted and inactive, no longer a weapon, but a reminder that boundaries existed and were enforceable. Cameras stayed on, recording nothing but wind and wildlife, and I checked them less often, not out of complacency, but trust. Prepared doesn't mean paranoid. It means ready without being consumed. Near the end of summer, a short letter arrived from a federal facility. It was from Linda Haraway. Brief, stripped of excuses, acknowledging harm caused not just to us but to the people she'd convinced herself were obstacles instead of neighbors. Emily read it once and slid it back into the envelope. Forgiveness didn't require conversation, and consequences had already done their work. That was enough. The following month, a regional paper ran a small feature on the butterfly sanctuary, focused on habitat restoration and education. No mention of arrests, no reference to bollards. Emily stood among the blooms in the photograph, monarchs resting on her shoulders like living ornaments. And for the first time, the story didn't need the conflict to be complete. The ranch returned to rhythm. Morning routines, seasonal work, quiet evenings. Visitors came only by invitation, usually students or researchers. The gate stayed closed otherwise, not in defiance, but in clarity. Boundaries don't need explanation once they're respected. Sometimes I thought about how easily everything could have gone differently if we'd ignored the first intrusion, if we'd assumed entitlement would burn itself out. It never does. It spreads until it meets resistance strong enough to stop it, and that resistance doesn't require rage, only preparation, documentation, and patience applied without drama. As fall approached again, monarch numbers peaked higher than the year before, proof that healing compounds when conditions allow it. The ranch stood quiet at dusk, cattle settling, cicadas humming, butterflies clustered for the night, and whatever came next, we were ready. Not because we expected conflict, but because readiness had become part of how we lived. And just like the story didn't end when the Ballards stopped rising, it didn't end here either. Because 3 months later, someone from the next county over tried to claim mineral rights under our land with similarly fraudulent paperwork and the same entitled attitude, a big mistake. And if you've ever dealt with an HOA abusing power or a nightmare like this, drop your story in the comments because I read every single one and respond to questions about defending property rights. And subscribe because people like this never stop trying, and neither do I. The Ranch Rights Legal Defense Fund is always taking new cases where precision and paperwork can serve real civilian justice. And remember this, your property is worth fighting for, and documentation beats intimidation every single time.